Hi everyone, Helen Blunden here at Activate Learn on Twitter. It is time for another book review, but before I jump into the review, I just want to make something clear. Now, you might be thinking, what's your process, your strategy, your framework for coming up with the books that you read? You're probably thinking you review all sorts of different books. Some of them are fiction, some of them are non-fiction, some are to do with history, some are to do with personal development. What's going on there? The thing is, there is no rhyme or reason to what I read. I simply pick out a book because it looks good, I might enjoy it, but most of all, what I'm looking at and wanting to get out of a book is some kind of inspiration or understanding of, I guess, the condition that we are in, or also what I'm going through, and then how can I apply it in my work or my life? How can I improve from it? So there's really no rhyme or reason to what I read. It's going to be a mixture of fiction, non-fiction, and it's certainly not for the purposes of getting more subscribers on this YouTube channel, selling a product or a service, building a business, none of that. This space, this YouTube channel, is my sense-making space, as is my blog. And so I use these spaces as purely means of being able to talk out, ask questions, learn from, pontificate, contemplate, reflect, whatever it is, to try and get some understanding. But it's not for the purposes of building an audience. Okay, so with that in mind, I'm going to talk about this particular review, What is to be Done? Political Engagement and Saving the Planet by Barry Jones. Now, this is very different to what I would usually read. Now, the reason I am starting to kind of change the books that I read to go into more politics, economy, history, government, society, is because last year, like many of us, we were contemplating, I guess, our lot in life. We were contemplating where we are today as a world, as a society, simply because the pandemic had put us into that position. So it put front and center a lot of situations that are happening in our world and then feeding into our own lives. And they've put it right, the pandemic put it right in front of us. So like many of the people, I started to reflect and sit and think about what are the changes that I need to do now in my life to be able to look forward to the next 5 years, 10 years into retirement, and so forth. At the same time, I also came to this realization that I really have no answers. I don't know what I don't know. And the world seemed a bit crazy. The world seemed that there were a lot of angry people, there was a lot of frustration. We saw with politics and the economy how things were just in constant turmoil. And part of me wanted to understand, how did we get to this point? How did we get to this point in 2020 where there's a pandemic and there's a whole heap of different issues that are bubbling around in the world, everything from violence, from the impact of the pandemic to different economies, from Trump. There's a whole heap of stuff that is currently happening in our world. And I was thinking, man, how did we get to this point? And knowing what we know now, what are the things I've got to be looking forward to? Now, I started to think that in order for me to understand how we got to this point, I really need to understand recent history. Now, I'm a bit of a history buff. I love history, but history, say, from 200 plus years. But I realized my gap was modern recent history. And I needed someone to be able to kind of collate all the things, the circumstances, the situations that had happened in modern recent history to tell me, where are we today? This is the reason why we are where we are today. And I could have gone and looked at and read a whole heap of different books on each and every little single circumstance, but that wouldn't be enough for me to just, I needed an overview. I guess I needed an overview. And so with this book, I got that overview, okay? I was in a Melbourne bookstore, and I was looking through the society government bookshelves, which is usually a section of a bookstore that I never visit. And I realized that I need to be in the different sections of the bookstore if I am to have a more worldly view. I need to kind of expand my reading and expand into different areas that I don't usually read. And so here I was, and I saw this book, and I picked it out straight away for two reasons. The first one, it mentions political engagement, which is to do obviously with politics, which is an area of non-interest for me, in the sense that I don't know enough and I'm definitely not politically engaged. So I picked out this book because of that. And the second reason is because of this bloke. This is Barry Jones. Now, many Australians would know Barry Jones is an ex-Labor minister and a highly intelligent, intellectual bloke, polymath, is very well known. And I thought, I've got to read his stuff. I had the pleasure of meeting Barry Jones back in 1996. At the time, I was on a group study exchange program to the Netherlands, and our small team was invited by the Australian ambassador Michael Tate at the time to have lunch at the Australian embassy. Naturally, we accepted, and Barry Jones was also invited for lunch at the same time, and so it was an opportunity to meet him and also have lunch and ask questions. But back in 1996, I was a young woman who hadn't read his first book called Sleepers Wake, The Technology and the Future of Work. And I'm kicking myself now that I wish that I had read his book, and I wish that I had known a lot earlier on about the impact of technology to Australian industries, because I could have asked these questions. I could have been in a completely different point where I am now in 2021. I could have had different work. I could have met different people. I could have been on this journey that I've been on a lot earlier if I had read his first book, Sleepers Wake, and if I had, I guess, the gumption, the audacity to kind of ask more articulate, intelligent questions of him, so I could have been on this path a lot earlier than I have been right now here in my 50s. So if you don't believe me, one of the things I used to do is, here's our invitation. So there you go. Michael Tate, Ambassador of Australia, invites us to a luncheon. It was the 10th of May 1996. And I also took the nameplates, and here's the honorary Barry Jones's lunch plate, which I did ask to take, and they said, yeah, sure, go for it. So this was all back in the day before taking selfies and using your phone for a camera. Anyway, enough of that. I've rambled on a lot, but this has given you, I guess, a background as to why I picked up this book and why I read it. Now, this book is, I guess, a continuation of his first book. When he wrote his first book, it was in 1982. And Sleepers Wake, Technology and the Future of Work, in 1982 had claimed and actually was quite visionary in its approach with regards to telling and preempting Australia as to what is going to happen in the future with regards to manufacturing industries and the types of jobs. But what had happened was the book itself was not accepted or not taken as seriously by the Australian government at the time, especially because the Australian government was appeasing to the needs of the workers in the manufacturing industry. I mean, they don't want to know that, the industry is going to change with technology. So the book itself, his first book, was not as popular as it was overseas. His first book captured the attention of people like Bill Gates, who met up with Barry Jones to talk about the book. Now, many years later, Barry has written What is to be Done, Political Engagement and Saving the Planet. And this time round, what he has done is he, in about 14 or so chapters, creates the overview of where we are today as a nation in Australia and where we are today in the world, and put some questions to us as to what really needs to be done about changing our perspective and our viewpoints and taking some actions, both as a government but also as individuals, to start preparing for the future. Now, he talks about the four horsemen of the apocalypse and how they're all linked. And his four horsemen is population growth, climate change, pandemics, and racism and state violence. And all of these are linked to each other, and we are seeing them currently today. And what he does is he lays out towards the end a plan or an outline of what needs to happen with regards to reforming the parliament, reforming the constitution, and getting us to really think about engaging in the political process, because right now democracy seems to be kind of a loose term because of what we see on the media and how completely disengaged people are from the political process. Now, in chapter 2, he talks about, he highlights the history of democracy and how the democracy has changed to how we've become a more populist society, and how there are going to be, and there are, some challenges to democracy. Things like hate media, how advertising and marketing have just made us into constant consumers, how we change our language, how religion seems to be a political force, and the collapse of truth. He then, in chapter 3, talks about the Enlightenment, and he talks about the start of, the agricultural revolution that fed into the industrial revolution, that fed into the fundamentalist revival, and what is enlightenment now. In chapter 4, he talks about the digital revolution. He steps us through the internet, the smartphones, social media, Facebook, privacy, hacking, stalking, trolling, and also talks about the big tech giants and their impact in our world. Chapter 5, oh my God, you got to read chapter 5. Chapter 5 is all about Trump. He gets a chapter on his own. And I must admit, chapter 5, I was sitting there on the lounge and I was yelling out some of the quotes that I was reading to my husband, who was agreeing with what Barry Jones was saying. But seeing the whole of chapter 5 and what Trump has done and all the illogical things that he has done, seeing it in print, it defied belief. But chapter 5 is a good one. Now, chapter 6 and 7, he starts going into the climate change, and he talks about the science in one chapter and then the politics in another chapter. So he also talks about, in chapter 8, retail politics. He talks about Nixon's silent majority, John Howard, an Australian Prime Minister's legacy, Scott Morrison's quiet Australians. He talks about racism and spin, Brexit, leadership and the authenticity aspect, and the decline of trust. Chapter 9, he then starts talking about how we've lost our ability to be able to structure an argument. And I must admit, growing up in Australia in the 70s and listening in the 80s to our ministers discuss and debate policy, create new policies, they seem to be a lot more forward thinking in the earlier days. Right now, our government only sits for 67 days of a year. They only sit and actually discuss and debate. Not even that. They're not even discussing or debating. There is no long-term view. So in that chapter, he talks about the loss of language, I guess the trivialization of language, the fact that, say, Trump has just an 8th grader literacy, the fact that he just constantly repeats certain words, and he says the same about our Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, as well. He really, towards the end, he starts saying to us, well, we've got to start being honest with ourselves, knowing that this is where we've come from. What do we need to do to start making changes, to start thinking a lot more long term? And so he talks about how we might have to, we will need to think about reforming the Constitution, reforming our Parliament. We really have to sit and think about even how we defer to our allies and, what we tolerate, and also understanding that in our society there's a widening gap between rich and poor, which is creating a whole heap of issues. In one chapter, he then just talks about coronavirus and how that has just kind of pushed all these issues right front and center. And in the last chapter, What is to be Done, Political Engagement and Climate Change, he sets through some ideas of what are some of the things that we really need to sit and do and take action on. And he just lists them in dot points. And a lot of these are all about, number one, renovate or replace the Australian Constitution, adopting a Bill of Rights, having an open government. And our Australian government is one of the most secretive governments in the world. So having an open government, having appropriate funding for trusted Australian institutions, recognising the value of humanities and the arts, re-establishing a moral basis for progressive taxation, and it goes on, okay? And there's a lot more. But one of these books, if you're interested in reading this book, all I would say is just be mindful that as he's Australian, he uses a lot of the Australian examples and Australian government. So any Australian would be reading this book and understanding it. However, for maybe someone who is from overseas, if you have an interest in Australia or some of our, themes and politics, this would definitely be of interest to you. But to anyone who is non-Australian or may not know of the Australian situational context, you might be a bit lost in some of the examples here. But not to worry, because a lot of this book is still actually telling us how we got to this point, and that is global. Where the examples are Australian, what I would suggest is you insert your own country's actions. What has been happening in your own country around these particular themes, and you can then put two and two together and actually see how it all flows. So whether it is an Australian context or Australian examples, it doesn't matter, because you could be in France and you could be thinking about, well, how is Macron doing what is written in here, what's happening in France, and how does it impact? Because I could guarantee it'll probably be the same thing. Maybe not, maybe for countries like Erdogan and Turkey and Trump, and anyway, we'll see. So, What is to be Done, Political Engagement and Saving the Planet by Barry Jones. I would highly recommend this book. I've already got people saying, Helen, I want to borrow that book, I want to read it. I'm thinking, get in line, get in line. Okay, so that is it. If you have read this book, or if you have got any other books that you think I should read that will also help me understand about political engagement, please let me know. Thank you for watching and listening. So bye for now.